Dolby Atmos came out of cinema and they brought it into the music world, and now we're all scrambling how to figure out what to do with it.
That's Adrian Weidmann, CEO and founder of Immersive Design Labs. He believes the biggest challenge with immersive audio is not the technology itself, but the lack of clarity around how musicians and engineers are meant to use it.
The design spec was for the preamplifier to be the electrical equivalent of effectively a 12-inch piece of copper wire. I wanted no coloration. I wanted the capsule to be a transducer.
He explains why immersive audio fails when engineers chase novelty instead of accuracy, and why purity of capture matters more than features or format.
That was a truly immersive audio experience. Everything about immersive just drew me right back into that, capturing musicians playing in a space.
In this conversation, Adrian breaks down how immersive audio is less about the future tech and more about reconnecting with how music was always meant to be heard. By the end of this conversation, you'll understand why immersive audio is not something to fear and how to think about it clearly, practically, and musically. Stick around. I'm Bobby Owsinski, and this is the Inner Circle Podcast. You worked for B&K for a while, and then Siemens. Then you left the business for quite a few years.
Yeah.
And then came back, which makes me think that there's something about immersive audio that really excites you.
Well, I think all of us in audio, it's a disease, isn't it? I mean, it's, it's in our blood, and I've always missed it, especially after those wonderful years at Brüel and Kjær. That was exceptional time. But I got a good colleague of mine, stayed in the test and measurement business, and we've been in touch over all the years. Oh boy, I bet you it's coming up on almost 2 years ago. Dan called me, and he was talking to a colleague, again, in the test and measurement world. And in that conversation, they brought up Brüel and Kjær, and Brüel and Kjær, at least the studio mics, shortly after I left, that rolled into DPA microphones. They were talking about that transition and what the success DPA has had over the years. And my friend said, I know the guy. These folks are in the test and measurement business, and said, well, gee, why can't we do that? And I had said, look, I've been out of the business a long time. And to begin with, let's at least do a discovery project to determine if there's even a there. Because my first reaction was, it could be interesting, but the world needs another microphone like a hole in the head.
True.
And especially, it brought back a lot of memories. Back in 81, 82, I had to walk around the planet knocking on doors, talking to recording engineers about this wonderful Omni microphone. I just got long stares. I should say outside of the classical music domain. I simply don't know if there's a there after all these years. We agreed to do that, and I literally honestly, Bobby, I just went back to the B&K playbook because it worked for me 35, 40 years ago. I saw no reason why it wouldn't be similar. So what I did, the gentleman that really helped me break the B&K microphones into the contemporary pop rock recording world was George Massenburg. I literally called George and hadn't spoken to him in probably 10 years. So I called George, and I remember very vividly, I was actually driving back from checking in on my mom from Milwaukee, Wisconsin on a Sunday morning. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning. My phone rings, and it was George. And of course, I pulled right over, and we ended up having this amazing, 45, 50-minute conversation. I got some prototypes together. He agreed to take a listen. I will simply say, for those of you that know George or don't know George, he came back and he said they didn't suck. So
That's so George.
So I took that as a win. Over the years, obviously, he and Elliot Shiner had become very close. And George says, well, send some to Elliot. His quote to me was, I put them on a grand piano and they sounded terrific. And this was just a prototype. This was literally just out of the gate. That discovery project, I did the report and essentially presented that. And the feedback was, well, this is fantastic, but we don't know anything about the music business, the recording business. And so the way we proceeded was I basically started Immersive Design Labs, and they became my investor. So where did the name come from, Immersive Design Labs? You asked me the question right off the top. Okay, so I determined I at least have a microphone. But again, going back to the B&K playbook, I had all these visions of me 40 years later knocking on doors going, hey, here's this great Omni microphone. I'm like, oh, no.
You can't do that again, right? Been there, done that. Yeah.
I can't go back to that well. And in sort of the, looking in the rearview mirror, although it wasn't by design, one of the timely events that happened when I introduced the B&K microphones was that same transition from analog to digital. That wave was happening at the same time. I realized that, again, not by design, but part of that, let's call it reception I received, that people would actually plug the microphone in and actually listen to it, was the fact that suddenly these engineers had essentially 20 dB more headroom. The microphone was self-noise of 15 dBA. It took advantage of what the recording medium was touting. I said, well, what is it today that I could ride that same wave? It was immersive audio. And what excited me about that was I started my career, I was in charge of all the remote recording for Wisconsin Public Radio back when I was going to school. And it was live radio broadcasts, jazz, classical, folk. What was always what I just loved was capturing musicians playing in a space. I just love that. And everything about immersive just drew me right back into that wonderful sound. It brought back a memory when I worked for Brüel & Kjær in Copenhagen. I went to see the Chieftains. It was down in Copenhagen. I'm sure it's long gone, but it was one of these old wooden oil storage tanks down by the harbor, down by the docks. I mean, he was huge. Yeah, I mean, massive, think of this massive oak barrel. It probably was, I bet it was 40, 50 feet tall. And the Chieftains effectively playing acoustically.
So the microphone you designed is brand new.
It effectively comes from the test and measurement world. It's a
there's two mics though, right?
There are three, but really there's two. It's a 1/2 inch. They're all Omni pressure microphones. One is a 1/2 inch capsule that is, 20K. We also have a 1 inch capsule, which is pretty exciting. It starts rolling off at about 12.5 kilohertz. They're both pre-polarized electrets. So I don't have to worry about the powering of the actual capsule. They're pre-polarized electrets with 300 volts deposited on the backplate. We were using that 1 inch B&K years ago, and I think DPA still carries that forward. But it's an expensive option. We've been experimenting with that 1 inch. We've had some great success on vocals using that 1 inch mic. Our focus has been on using the 1/2 inch microphones essentially matched in the 7.0.4 array that we have.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying today's conversation. Now let me ask you this. Have you ever boosted or cut with EQ but still couldn't get the sound you wanted? That's why I designed the Magic Frequencies cheat sheet to guide you step by step through the EQ frequencies to make your mixes shine with professional clarity. Scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the show notes for your free copy. Now, back to the episode. Was there a specific philosophy that you had in designing that array?
The simple truth was, I looked at the market and said, Dolby Atmos is quasi-standard, if you will. Before going out of the business, I'd spent 5-6 years with Neve, and we had, because of what we were doing at that time, we spent quite a bit of time in the cinema world. And so, Dolby Atmos is, of course, a cinematic theme. It came out of cinema, and they brought it into the music world, and we're all scrambling how to figure out what to do with it. But given what Dolby was doing with 7.0.4, I looked at how can we complement that array. And so what we designed was effectively an array that effectively replicated the positioning of the microphone to match the positioning of a 7.1.4 Dolby array. We looked at trying to keep it light, so it's all done in carbon fiber, so it's really nicely assembled. I wanted to keep it simple because I knew, looking into the arrays that people were using, it was, a lot of measurement, single mics, bolting this together, that together, and I wanted to simplify that. So that was effectively the basis of the design. And, it was fun because I actually got to use some of my mechanical engineering studies.
Oh, there you go. Yeah,
So
right.
I brought it back. So that was the basis of that. In terms of the microphone itself, we had a capsule. And again, in the test and measurement world, they don't really deal with phantom powering. It's 12 volts and different types of standard IEC powering schemes. So we designed the preamplifier. I cringed because George came back and he said, can you send me the schematic? And I went, ooh,
Yeah.
and I was like, I said, George, it's a prototype.
Yeah.
And I remember he came back and he said, there's an op amp in there. Why is there an op amp in there? And honestly, it was a prototype, and I was like, God, I don't know. So we went back to the design team. There's a reason why there was an op amp in there, but I said, we got to take that out. I'm not going to, I want, the design spec was for the preamplifier to be the electrical equivalent of effectively a 12-inch piece of copper wire. I wanted no coloration per se. I wanted the capsule to be a transducer. We've modified that, and like I say, that's the one that George came back and said it didn't suck.
Tell me the various applications that this could be used in, because the first thing that comes to your mind is, this is great for classical music. It's great for chamber orchestras, things like that. But I'm sure there's other situations that this could work well in.
About a year and a half ago, a good friend of mine who lives in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he's a very successful documentary maker. He, every so often, hosts house concerts of different musicians. And he had called me. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And he called me, said, have you ever heard of this artist, Willie Porter? And I said, I'd heard of him, but not heard his music or spent any time with it. He said, well, given what you're doing, he knew what I was sort of proposing with IDL. He said, I'm hosting a house concert on Friday night. You need to come down and check him out. So I drove from Minneapolis down to Milwaukee and met Willie, and we just hit it off. Willie's a phenomenal singer-songwriter, extraordinary guitar player. He just leaned into the whole concept of what I was proposing to do with IDL. And that was August of 24. Literally started IDL in August of that same month. And all of a sudden I'm staring down AES in New York and I'm going, I cannot let an AES go by without having some presence, although I wasn't really ready. I had some basic prototypes. And it just so happened that Willie was playing his little Northeast tour. So I booked the Power Station and just to try to get people in, just to listen. And then Willie called me, said, I'd like to introduce you to a friend of mine. I said, well, that's great. Well, his friend happened to be Neil Dorfman. And so that entered into a conversation, and Neil came in and engineered the session. Willie Porter, acoustic guitar on one side of the glass, and Neil set up, the array and all these different mics. And you go into the control room, and it was sort of like I described it as like the Maxell tape commercial. It was fantastic. But it sounded great, and everybody loved, just meeting Neil and having the whole conversation. But it set the tone for how can we proceed with this. And we were staring down NAMM in January of 25. I said, let's do a showcase. We booked East West Studio. Willie had done a project years ago with Matt Wallace, and then that ended up, Matt and Will Kennedy are sort of the dynamic duo in LA these days. And I had them come in to engineer the session. And Willie brought, he put together a band, an ensemble of himself, amazing woman, cellist by the name of Mai Bloomfield. She's LA based. She has a band called Raining Jane, and they have been the backing band for Jason Mraz for years and years and years. She's amazing vocalist and cellist. And then Ryan Pearl on guitar, again out of Milwaukee, and then vocalist Carmen Nickerson. And they rehearsed for weeks. Willie rehearsed because I said, look, I want to do a showcase. I've booked the room. I've paid for the engineers. Take advantage of the day. And so Willie was like, well, let's take advantage of all the studio time. I think we recorded 6 tracks, 6 songs in that one day. We had the array. They had set up around the array, sort of a semicircle, if you will. Matt Wallace, great production. He introduced what ended up being a fascinating and wonderful idea. The dry signal off the acoustic guitars were essentially being picked up by the mics around the front of the array to the sides. And then Mai was on one side of the array. Ryan had a mandolin and resonator guitar on the other side of the array. Their wet signals, in other words, they both had, the effects pedals. They went to the opposite. We routed those to the opposite back side of the array and played those effects in QSC wedges. So you had this truly, sort of immersive sound field, essentially live tracks, no overdubs. Each microphone was directly patched to its affiliated loudspeaker in a 7.1.4 array that session, Cali Audio had come in and set up their system. People were listening, not going through the Dolby renderer, just literally 1-to-1. And I remember it took 2 or 3 explanations of telling people what they were actually hearing. There were stunned silence. I can't describe it any other way. People could not believe what they were actually hearing. And so at the end of that night, I remember we all sort of, as we're cleaning up, there was probably 3 minutes where nobody said anything. And we all sort of looked at each other, and it was that moment where we realized we really had captured lightning in a bottle. And so that put things in motion. That said, well, wait a second, there's an album here. And so I continued the process. We did We did essentially the same group, similar setup, and we went to Nashville and did Ocean Way in June, and then we got 4 tracks out of that session, and then Matt and Will mixed the final album, which Willie released as Humans in a Room. Bluegrass, Americana. I would love to see a hip-hop artist take advantage of this. We played it at the event that we did on Monday just for practice. Again, it was an experiment. We went to a friend of mine's studio just outside of Worcester, Mass, because I sensed that people were thinking, well, not everybody can do live to essentially 11 track. And so I sense people were, putting the array and this approach into a box that says, well, if you don't do it that way, it's not a valued, I can't do that. So the experiment, mid-December, Willie came out to Boston, to Worcester, and the experiment was using the array, same microphone, experiment with overdubbing. So Willie did a bass track, I should say a foundational track, him on acoustic guitar, and then using the same array, same room, don't touch anything, he moved around the array and did 2 vocal overdubs, sort of left and right side, 2 guitar overdubs, left and right. We had a percussionist do some things behind the array. We just all looked at each other going, this just sounds absolutely amazing. One of the things that the contemporary recording, where we've gotten to, these rooms have become so dead. We're all cardioid, dead rooms. Let's do close miking. Every time one does that, you squeeze emotion out of the instrument, out of the voice, in my humble opinion. They're forced to do that because now the technologies, you have all these wonderful plugins and limitless channels and so forth. And I think the music has paid a price for that. I'm trying to push is embrace the bleed. The room itself should become an active instrument, and musicians work, they interact with each other into that acoustic space.
I remember working at Criteria in Miami, and they were just finishing up a new room. And I remember walking in and feeling, and it was a big room with really high ceilings, and thinking to myself, this feels like an anechoic chamber. It was it was so dead. So the first band that came in was kind of like a metal band, and they complained that all their amplifiers are blowing up because they couldn't get it loud enough for them to be able to hear. So they kept on going through these stacks, and finally they just left because it was just too dead.
What we're trying to do, and I think what we're trying to work towards, is every song lives with the story that it's trying to convey, lyrically, musically. There is a room ambience reverb that will complement the lyrics and the instrumentation of that song. I see a point where each song will be affiliated with its appropriate acoustic space.
By the way, I listened to Willie's material
great.
that was on the site, and it was fantastic. I was thinking to myself, wow, this is just marvelous. So, yes, I get it.
Absolutely minimalist. I mean, there's no, we're not EQing, we're not, there's tweaks and a little compression on that microphone and so forth, but it's them. It really is the musicians in the room. One of the things that we do that absolutely makes this work is once we get the microphone array set up, again, listen. Let the musicians, place them where we think it's best in the sound field, given the song. But then what we do is we'll ask the musicians to it's the proverbial, give us your fortissimo, give us the loudest thing. Of course, you're never, it's never as loud as what they actually play. We get a reference reading of what at the microphone that's at the closest source to get the loudest, whatever it is, peak at, it can be 116 dB or whatever the measurement is. But we have a calibrator. It will put exactly 114 dB at the diaphragm of each microphone. And now you go around the full array and you set the input, you set your mic pre, and you zero them all against your, whatever you want to do, minus 18 or minus 20, all relative to the overall level of the performance. They're all going to hear what's happening in that sound field. But they will hear, if at the front of the array, in this case, Willie might be singing, he might be off that microphone by only 12 inches. The furthest microphone in the array is still hearing him sing. It's in the exact relationship of everything else in the sound field. And that's what makes this sparkle.
I've always been a big proponent of an Omni microphone.
I believe in them. I remember Ola Brosted Sorensen, who was the chief designer of the B&K studio mics in Denmark. Keith came to the factory and he wrote an article and interviewed Ola. And Ola made the comment that he said, again, this is you have to put your Brüel and Kjær glasses on, test and measurement. In that environment, a microphone is considered a transducer. And it is to accurately change this pressure wave into its equivalent electrical signal. And he said, anything other than an Omni is a compromise.
In your journeys, which have been in and out of the business, what's the best piece of advice that maybe somebody imparted to you, or maybe you learned yourself along the way?
I will tell you one, and it wasn't even so much specific to this business, but it just came up Monday night, and it was in a conversation with Willie. The gentleman who I mentioned early on, Chip Duncan is his name, fantastic videographer, very successful. And I asked Chip once, I said, why are you successful? There's videographers all over, why are you successful? And without hesitation, Chip looked at me and he said, I show up. And I thought, wow, that's great advice. And even in this business, I will tell you, it matters. I try to show up. One of the amazing things with our event, a Monday, I was able to get from 5 o'clock in the evening till 9:30 in the evening, and never once, and this was by design, never once did I give a spec. And I thought, that's great, because nobody, yes, it's a conversational piece, and yes, you have to have those chops. It doesn't matter if, it's about what people hear. And that was really the focus of the panel. We had Carrie Thomas, Ryan Ilyadi, Justin Gray, whose record is up for a Grammy this year for under the immersive category. If you ever get a chance, listen to that material. His work is stunning as a musician, producer, engineer. He's done some amazing stuff. And then Mai and Willie were there. And the focus was on the song, create the song, come to the studio with a song and try to capture the song and all the emotions that are associated with the interaction with the musicians. And that's what I'm having fun doing, empowering that to happen. Because God didn't give it to me in my fingers, I'm able to sort of live vicariously through these projects.
Carry on with it. It's a very cool venture that you're doing, and again, that makes so much sense how you put it together. So congratulations on that.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to have you interview and have this conversation. So thank you so much.
Thanks for listening and being in my inner circle. Remember, if you have any questions or comments, you can send them to questions@bobbyowsinski.com. You can also learn all about the latest in music, audio, and production news, and find out about openings for my latest online classes at bobbyowsinski.com. This is Bobby Owsinski. I will see you next time.